Section 7.2, Linear Equations. In Section 7.1, we discussed the slope-intercept form of an equation and how to graph lines using that formula. We will expand upon those ideas in this section. To start with, we are going to go through and we are going to graph the two lines y equals negative 3/4 x plus 1 and also the line y equals 4/3 x subtract 3. Now on the next slide I'm going to graph those two. If you'd like some practice on what we did in 7.1, you could go ahead and find a piece of graph paper and graph those yourself and then compare with mine, but I will graph those on the next slide. Okay, I did not want to take the time in this video to go through and draw these, but if you drew these on your own graph paper, hopefully this is what your graphs look like. You can see that the blue line is the top line, y equals negative 3/4 x plus 1, and the red line is the y equals 4/3 x minus 3. What do you notice about those two lines? Hopefully you notice that those two lines, they meet at a right angle. If you took a piece of paper and took the corner of the piece of paper and held it there, you would see that that would be a perfect 90-degree angle where those two meet. And they meet there, they are perpendicular lines to each other because of their slopes. The blue line had a slope of negative 3/4. The red line had a slope of a positive 4/3. Well, what's true about those two slopes? If you take a look at that, the slopes use the same numbers. One is the flip-flopped version of the other one. Negative 3/4 is 4/3. And they're also opposite of each other. One is a negative, one is a positive. Which leads us to the first idea that we need to talk about in this section. Lines that are perpendicular have what's known as opposite, which means one's positive, one's negative, reciprocal slopes. Perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slopes. So if I know that I have two lines that are perpendicular and I know the slope of one of those lines, I would automatically know the slope of the other line. So, using that information that two lines that are perpendicular have opposite reciprocal slopes, I have four different equations listed here, A, B, C, and D. Which two of those lines, if I graph them, would be perpendicular to one another? All I have to do is take a look at their slopes. The very first one has a slope of 2/3. And B has a slope of negative 2/3. Those two cannot be because they're not opposite reciprocals. But I'm taking a look at B, which is a slope of negative 2/3. Is there one that's the opposite reciprocal of a negative 2/3? Well, there is. The 3/2 is the opposite, and it's also the reciprocal. So the two that are perpendicular to each other are lines B and line D. And all I'm doing is looking at their slopes to see which ones have opposite reciprocal slopes. So if perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slopes, what must be true of parallel lines? Parallel lines, lines that are exactly the same distance apart, they're equidistant apart all the time, parallel lines, well, they must have exactly the same slope. So when I take a look at these four equations again, which ones have exactly the same slope? Well, A is 2/3 and C is 2/3. So A and C would be parallel to each other. Remember, parallel lines have exactly the same slope. So the first part of this section just talks about the slopes of parallel lines and perpendicular lines. How about if you didn't know the equations of two different lines, but instead you knew the points that they went through? So here I have two different lines and I give you the information of the points that they go through. Well, I could use the idea of slope in order to figure out what their slopes are. Remember, slope is defined as the change in y compared to the change in x. So a formula that we've talked about before is you can have y of 2 minus y of 1 over x of 2 minus x of 1. So I could deal with the first line here, and I could figure out the slope of that first line. So that slope of the first line, I would have y of 2 minus y of 1 over x of 2 minus x of 1. If I solve that, I am going to get 4 over 3. So the slope of line number 1 is 4/3. Line number 2 that I have there passes through these points, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do y of 2 minus y of 1, so that would be 2 minus a negative 1 over negative 5 minus a negative 1. Well, 2 minus a negative 1 is equal to 3. Negative 5 subtracting negative 1 is equal to a negative 4. So the slope of this is really a negative 3/4. Line 1 has a slope of 4/3. Line 2 has a slope of negative 3/4. They're opposite reciprocals of one another, so I know that these two lines are perpendicular to each other. Another idea talked about in this section is to find the equation of a line given the slope of the line and one point that it goes through. In order to do this, I am going to use the formula y equals mx plus b, which is the slope-intercept form of the equation. And all I'm going to do is plug in the information. Now for this one, I know that the slope is a negative 2. So I am going to have y equals negative 2 is the slope, and the y and the x are going to be part of the formula, and the b stands for where it crosses the y-intercept. Well, I know, or what the y-intercept is. I know that the y-intercept here is a negative 4 because x is 0. So the equation of this line is just going to be y equals negative 2x minus 4. But let's take a look at another one that maybe isn't quite so easy. Let's say I have a line that goes through the point negative 1, positive 2, and it has a slope of 3. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to have to do a little bit more algebra in order to figure that out. Eventually, I want it in the form y equals mx plus b. I know m is equal to 3 because that's the slope. So I'm going to put in y equals 3x plus b. Now I'm going to take a look at the point that I have. The point that I have, 2 is the y and negative 1 is the x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute those 2 points in. I'm going to have 2 is equal to 3 times negative 1 plus b. And now I just need to go through and solve that for b. If I do that, I get 2 equals negative 3 plus b. I'm going to add 3 to both sides, and I am going to get 5 is equal to b. So now I know everything that I need to know in order to give the equation of the line. I know what the slope is. The slope is 3. I know what the y-intercept is. The y-intercept is 5. So the equation of my line is y equals 3x plus 5. And all I did was I went through and did some algebra in order to do that. Let's go through another example just like the previous one. What's the equation of a line if it goes through the point 5, negative 3 and has a slope of 2/5? Before going on to the last idea in this section, let's take a look at one other one that's just a little bit different. What's the equation of a line that goes through the point 4, 3 and has a slope of 0? I want to remind you that a slope of 0 means that what we have is we have a horizontal line. So if I were to draw this out, I'm going to just kind of sketch this out on a graph right now. I have a horizontal line that goes through the point 4, 3. So it basically goes through right there. And that means that my y is always equal to 3. So for this, my equation would just be y is equal to 3. All horizontal lines are y equals something. If it's a vertical line, then it would be x equals something. So in case this, the blue line that I have right now, that would be x is equal to a positive 2. So that we really don't need to do any math. We could do math, algebra, if we wanted to with that, but that one might be just as easy to kind of draw out. Just remember what exactly it means if you have a slope of 0. The last idea in this section is to find the equation of a line if you're just given 2 points. Now there's several different ways to do this, but I like to just go through and first of all figure out what is the slope between those 2 points. So I'm going to use that slope, the change in y over the change in x. So if I go through and do that, I'm going to do my change in y first, 4 minus a negative 2 over 6 minus 3. 4 subtract negative 2 gives me a positive 6. 6 minus 3 gives me 3. So I know the slope is equal to 2. Now I'm going to do just what I got done doing here a few moments ago. I have y equals mx plus b. I know that my slope is 2. So I'm going to have y equals 2x plus b. Now I can choose either one of these points, put them in for x and y, and go through and figure out what the answer is. I'm going to choose this one. It will work for either one. So y is equal to 4, x is equal to 6. So I'm just going to substitute those in for the x and y, and I'm going to solve this for b. So I get 4 is equal to 12 plus b. I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. So I get negative 8 is equal to b. So now I know what my slope is. I know my slope is 2. I know my y-intercept is negative 8. So I can write my equation. My equation would be y equals 2x subtract 8. Let's do one more example. I have these 2 points and I need to determine the equation for those 2 points. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out the slope. So the change in y would be negative 2 subtract 3 over the change in x would be 4 minus a negative 1. If I go through and solve that, negative 2 subtract 3 gives me a negative 5. 4 minus negative 1 gives me a positive 5. So I know that the slope in this particular case is a negative 1. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to put the information in that I know into the form y equals mx plus b. I know that the slope is a negative 1, so I have y equals a negative x, thinking about that as a negative 1, plus b. And I'm going to put some points in. And once again, it doesn't matter if I choose this set of points or this set of points. I'll choose the 4 and the negative 2. So the y is equal to negative 2, y equals negative x. X is equal to 4, so that's going to be a negative 4 plus b. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. I'm going to get 2 is equal to b. So I know that my slope is a negative 1. I know that my y-intercept is 2. So the equation is y equals negative x plus 2. This concludes this video for section 7.2. As always, if I can help in any way, please let me know.